Welcome to the podcast of the IEEE Transactions on Haptics. This podcast is designed to help you keep informed on topics in haptics while you're on the go by providing a brief summary of the articles in each issue. It is produced by Vincent Levesque, Ilana Niski, Mikhail Vyacheslevsky, and William Provencher, with the help of the authors of each article. This podcast gives an overview of the 15 articles found in the 2014 April through June special issue on rehabilitation and neural engineering.
This first article investigates the encoding of tactile stimuli by the human nervous system. Its title is Validating a Population Model of Tactile Mechanotransduction of Slowly Adapting Type 1 Afferents at Levels of Skin Mechanics, Single Unit Response, and Psychophysics, by Gerling et al. The goal of this research is to build and validate a multi-level computational model of tactile neurons embedded in cutaneous skin. The authors built a model that includes a finite element representation of the distal phalange and a population of single receptor models distributed over its surface. Different strategies for population encoding were used. The model was validated by comparing its predictions to previous studies on the neurophysiology and psychophysics of touch. The authors found that the model's predictions closely match the findings of 3 previous studies with respect to skin surface deflection, single afferent firing to an intershift, and psychophysical response for sphere discrimination. The main contribution of this paper is a validated computational model of tactile mechanotransduction that can be used to test various population encoding strategies. This next article presents a study of vibrotactile and electrotactile feedback for hand prosthesis. Its title is Hive, Hybrid Vibro-Electrotactile Stimulation is an efficient approach to multi-channel sensory feedback, by D'Alonso et al. The goal of this research is to evaluate the ability of multiple hybrid stimulators that provide both vibrotactile and electrotactile feedback to convey spatially distributed tactile information. The hybrid vibroelectrotactile stimulators, or Hive, were designed to provide haptic feedback with both modalities at the same location using a compact configuration. The authors ran a study to compare the ability of subjects to recognize multi-channel stimulation delivered to the forearm using either the proposed hybrid stimulators or single modality stimulators with electrotactile or vibrotactile feedback alone. The authors found that multiple hybrid stimulators can be used to provide multi-channel sensory information with equivalent performance to single modality stimulators that are larger in size and with better performance than single modality stimulators of the same size. The main contribution of this paper is a demonstration that hybrid vibroelectrotactile stimulators can decrease the size of a prosthesis sensory feedback interface without compromising performance.
This next article investigates guiding hand motions using directional tactile feedback. Its title is Planar Hand Motion Guidance Using Fingertip Skin Stretch Feedback, by Norman et al. The goal of the study was to evaluate the accuracy of using fingertip skin stretch as a method of directional cueing for planar arm and hand motion. The authors describe experimental evaluations of a custom-designed device capable of providing direction cues to a user's finger pad by stretching its skin. In an 8-direction angle matching test, users match the motion of their hand to the direction of the skin stretch stimulus. During motion guidance tests, users followed skin stretch cues to make movements that span the extent of their entire reachable workspace. In addition, the authors explored providing real-time corrective feedback to counteract user errors, including errors that may have resulted from distorted haptic perception. The authors found that their low-cost portable device can accurately communicate 8 discrete planar movement directions. There were directional biases in users' performance in the guidance tasks, but providing corrective feedback using skin stretch cues helped the user to perform accurate movements. The authors believe that this device has the potential for use in low-cost, in-home upper extremity motor therapy.
The
This next article presents a robotic system that encourages social interaction of children with special needs. Its title is Design of a Robotic Mobility System with a Modular Haptic Feedback Approach to Promote Socialization in Children, by Chen and colleagues. The ultimate goal of this research is to train children with special needs to be more social. This particular paper demonstrates a system that uses a mobile robot with a force feedback steering wheel to guide the children's movement. The study presents a robotic mobility device and a tracking system. The haptic algorithm assists or resists the motion of the user only when they run off course and guidance is needed. It is able to track multiple moving targets and find a path that leads to the goal while ensuring the safety of the driver. The system can be used to train children to interact with caregivers and peers. The author developed a ball game using this system and showed that children in the training group drove closer to the ball possessed by a group of peers with the force feedback activated. Learning of social habits has also been observed. This paper is the first attempt at providing haptic guidance for improving children's development and socialization. This next article presents the study of the discriminability of edges with artificial hands equipped with tactile sensing. And it's entitled Spatial Asymmetry in Tactile Sensor Skin Deformation Aids the Perception of Edges Orientation During Haptic Exploration, by Ponce Wong et al. The long-term goal of this research is to restore the sense of touch to upper limb amputees. In this study, the authors equipped an artificial hand with sensors that record skin deformation, pressure, and vibration. Using bio-inspired haptic exploration procedure, they can estimate the orientation of an edge, one of the most salient features of 3D shape. Trends in the tactile data during multiple phases of finger-object contact were used as input to a model for estimating the edge orientation with respect to the fingertip. The author found that spatial asymmetry in the skin deformation data was especially important for estimating the orientation of edges. Establishing the orientation of an edge is useful for building an internal model of an unseen object and planning its manipulation. Such internal model could enable a robotic hand to perform low-level adjustments semi-autonomously. The user, free from the management of grip stability, will be able to concentrate on higher-level tasks such as manipulation.
This next article investigates robotic neurocognitive therapy exercises for patients with neurological injury. Its title is Neurocognitive Robot-Assisted Therapy of Hand Function, by Metzger et al. The goal of the study is to implement, validate, and assess the clinical feasibility and acceptance of neurocognitive therapy exercises on a custom-designed hand rehabilitation robot. The authors used a robotic device to implement 3 different exercises aiming to promote motor, sensory, and cognitive functions recovery in neurologically impaired patients. These exercises focused on improvement of hand function via interactions with virtual objects. Movement and force data recorded from the robot during a pilot study with 5 patients were used to assess clinical feasibility, and questionnaires answers by the same patients were used to assess treatment acceptance. The results of the paper indicate that neurocognitive robot-assisted therapy is feasible and is highly accepted by neurological patients. The fusion of neurocognitive therapy with robot-assisted rehabilitation using high-fidelity haptic interfaces holds the potential of enriching therapeutic approaches by focusing on the role of haptics and may provide novel insights into the mechanism of sensory motor impairment and recovery.
This next article reviews the haptic training literature from the perspective of the field of motor learning. Its title is Motor Learning Perspectives on Haptic Training for the Upper Extremities, by Williams and Carnahan. The goal of this research is to examine recent studies in haptic training for the upper extremities in the context of some key motor learning principles. The authors identify recent studies that use haptics for the purpose of teaching a motor skill to healthy participants and examine the terminology used and the presence of motor learning principles in the rationale and discussion of the work. These studies are used as illustrative examples for outlining key motor learning principles that apply to haptic training and to develop a taxonomy of haptic training paradigms. The main contribution of this work is a discussion of haptic training studies centered on 4 important motor learning concepts: performance versus learning, feedback, observational learning, and functional task difficulty. A classification of terms describing haptic training is also proposed based on an analysis of the extensive and sometimes redundant vocabulary used in the literature.
This next article presents a closed-loop control of body posture by moving a platform lightly touched with a fingertip. It's entitled Closed-Loop Kinesthetic Feedback for Postural Control Rehabilitation by Verité, Bacha, and Morel. The goal of this research is to present investigation on the use of kinesthetic biofeedback that uses light touch from a fingertip to control posture. When standing, the action of touching a fixed surface dramatically decreased the body sway. Additionally, the author noted that displacing the fingertip influences posture. They used a 4th platform that measures the center of pressure of the participant and a belt mechanism that laterally moved the fingertips to control the posture. They show that they can effectively control the position of the center of pressure using closed-loop kinesthetic feedback. This research is interesting for postural rehabilitation therapists and associated technical researchers that seeks a new way to provide biofeedback. The results of the paper are also interesting to neuroscientists.
This next article investigates the role of kinesthetic, cutaneous, and visual feedback in motor adaptation. Its title is Effects of Kinesthetic and Cutaneous Stimulation During the Learning of a Viscous Force Field by Rosati et al. The goal of this research is to understand how force, cutaneous, and visual feedback contribute to human adaptation to a velocity-dependent perturbation of their arm movement. Participants perform point-to-point reach movements while grasping a joystick and wearing a pair of cutaneous devices. The authors presented the participants with various combinations of force, cutaneous, and visual perturbations that were proportional and perpendicular to their arm's velocity. To assess adaptation, they examined the changes in path error following the presentation of the perturbations and the after effects of their removal. The authors found that force feedback played the most important role in adaptation to velocity-dependent perturbations, and that visual feedback contributed to adaptation. Cutaneous stimuli did not affect movement paths when presented in isolation, but slightly reduced perturbation's effect when presented together with force feedback.
The following article presents the development and evaluation of a robotic system for stroke rehabilitation called Haptic Drive. It's entitled Design and Development of an Affordable Haptic Robot with Force Feedback and Compliant Actuation to Improve Therapy for Patients with Severe Hemiparesis by Theriault, Nagurka, and Johnson. The goal of this research is to develop a strong, safe, and low-cost robotic environment that can provide therapy for stroke survivors. The study describes the hardware and software development of improved version of TheraDrive, an existing low-cost therapy environment that uses commercial steering wheels and games. The ability of the system to support therapy with very low-functioning subjects is increased via the addition of haptic feedback. The design maintains a low cost that is important for wide adoption. The key contribution of this research are both a variable compliance torque limiter and new adaptive control algorithm. The implementation creates a unique solution to the problem of local therapy for severely impaired persons. The development is significant to engineers, roboticists, and persons working in rehabilitation of stroke survivors.
This next article investigates upper limb robot-assisted training and force-based evaluation of motor recovery in stroke patients. Its title is Mechanisms of Motor Recovery in Chronic and Subacute Stroke Patients Following a Robot-Aided Training by Mazzoleni et al. The goal of the study is to develop a method for identifying different motor recovery mechanisms in chronic and subacute stroke patients during upper limb robot-assisted training using movement velocity and interaction forces. In the study, the movements and forces that the patients applied on the end effector of an in-motion 2 robotic device were recorded during their training. In addition, their impairment level before and after the entire intervention was evaluated using standard clinical scales, the Motor Status Scale and the Fugl-Meyer Assessment Scale. The authors showed that intensive goal-directed upper limb robot-assisted treatment improved the clinical as well as velocity-based assessments of motor impairment in subacute and chronic patients. In addition, the authors concluded that monitoring of the forces that are exerted on the robotic end effector by the patient during treatment can be useful for identifying motor recovery stages and may be used to tailor a patient-specific rehabilitation. This next article presents the development of a novel controller and a tactile feedback mechanism for a low-cost prosthetic hand. Its title is Exploring Teleimpedance and Tactile Feedback for Intuitive Control of the PISA IIT Soft Hand by Ajudani et al. The goal of the study was to develop a robust, efficient, intuitive, and low-cost myoelectric controller for the PISA IIT Soft Hand prosthesis, and equip it with mechano and vibrotactile interfaces. The authors used a 2-channel EMG signal to command the reference position and the impedance of a synergy-based robotic hand controller. They used a disturbance observer to estimate the interaction forces with the grasped objects, and presented them to the user via an inflating cuff on the upper arm. To provide the user with transient information about contact with the objects and their texture, they presented the finger's acceleration via vibration feedback on the forearm. They conclude the paper with an experimental evaluation of grasp robustness and intuitiveness of their hand control. The authors found that their novel EMG-driven compliance controller, together with their implemented haptic feedback, facilitated the execution of safe and stable grasps with the robotic hand. These results suggest that a low-cost, robust hand prosthesis employing hardware-based synergies can be a good alternative to traditional myoelectric prosthesis.
This next article presents a new 3 degrees of freedom haptic interface for investigating planar arm movement. And it's entitled 3DOM, a 3 degrees of freedom manipulendum to investigate redundant motor control, by Klein, Roche, and Burdet. The goal of this research is to investigate arm movement when limbs are connected via kinematic links. One of the most important issues in human motor control is to understand how the central nervous system distributes the movement to various joints of the body. This article describes the specification, design, and implementation of the 3DOM haptic interface. The paper demonstrates the advantageous dynamic property provided by the 3DOM and how it can be used to investigate the control of the redundant arm. The device is the first robotic interface that allows for the investigation of the 3D planar arm movement without requiring an exoskeleton. Due to the parallel structure, the mechanism is stiff, yet the actuator can be placed on the base, which enables 3DOM to produce highly dynamic environments.
This next article presents a novel haptic device designed for in-home rehabilitation. Its title is Portable Haptic Interface with Omnidirectional Movement and Force Capability by Avizzano, Sattler, and Urfaldi. The goal of this research is to design and characterize an ungrounded, self-powered, and portable force feedback device for rehabilitation applications. The authors describe the design of an omnidirectional platform that provides force feedback to the hand with 2 degrees of freedom using an omni-wheel transmission. The authors discuss their decisions concerning functional aspects, position sensing, control algorithms, force rendering, and mechanical and electronic design. They also present the results of several experiments evaluating the performance of the haptic interface. The main contribution of this paper is the design and characterization of a new type of rehabilitation interface that combines the principles of mobile robotics with the requirements for haptic interaction. This last article presents a study of the perception and recreation of applied forces. Its title is To Know Your Own Strength, Overriding Natural Force Attenuation, by Valles and Reed. The goal of this research is to determine whether the natural tendency to underestimate self-generated forces can be corrected with training. Known as force attenuation, this phenomenon causes self-generated forces to be perceived as weaker than externally generated forces of the same magnitude. The authors asked participants to replicate a force applied to one hand with the other, causing them to underestimate the forces that they applied. The participants were then given feedback about the accuracy of the recreated forces during a training phase, and were tested the next day to evaluate the persistence of any improvement. The authors found significant improvements in force recreation accuracy both immediately after training and after a day. The main contribution of this paper is experimental evidence that individuals can learn to overcome the force attenuation that naturally occurs during force recreation.
This concludes our podcast for this issue of the IEEE Transactions on Haptics. Hope you'll tune in again for our next issue.